Okay, so this is day 10. So first, what we have to do is that we have to solve the following identities in two different ways. Explain and show all work. Explain the strategy and why you chose this. Okay, so first, we have tan x equals cosecant x all over secant x. So first, what we can do is we can convert this tan into sine x over cosine x because these two are equal, and cosine x is basically the reciprocal, which is 1 over sine x. So these two are multiplied, and we know that secant x is the reciprocal of cosecant, so we have 1 over cosine x. Secant is a reciprocal of cosine, so we know that's 1 over cosine x. So what we can do is that we can multiply these two. So when we do, we see that the sine x and sine x cancel out, and all we are left with is 1 over cosine x, and this denominator stays the same. So you have 1 over cosine x over 1 over cosine x, and because it's reciprocal, because it's dividing something by the same thing, we know that these when we divide, we get that the answer is 1. So the second strategy how to do this is that we can keep tan the same, but we can what we also can do is that we can still cosecant and secant like convert it into the reciprocals. We have tan x times 1 over sine x over 1 over cosine x. So now what we do is that we just switch these. So because it's reciprocal, like we can just do cosine x times sine x, cosine x over sine x, and multiply it. So what we have left is tan x times 1 over cosine x over sine x times 1, which is basically the same thing. So we just have tan x times cosine x over sine x, and we know that cosine over sine x cosine x over sine x is cotangent x. So we know, so tan x times cotangent, so that would just be the reciprocal again, and so we would have tan times 1 over tan x, which is basically cotangent, and we know that again this would equal 1. So explain the strategy and why you chose those. So I chose them because we know that these two identities are equal. Like we know tan is equal to sine over cosine. Cosecant is reciprocal of sine. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine. We multiply, and then we see that this simplifies into 1. So it's like more simple that way rather than just saying this. You have to convert these identities, and same thing for here. We know that we kept tan the same here, but if we do convert these two, and then we multiply this by cosine over sine x, we know that we get this, and then tan x times cosine x times sine x, and then this cosine over sine is cotangent, and anything like tan times its reciprocal would equal 1. So the next question, cotangent x minus sine x times cosine x over cosine squared x. So we know that cotangent x is equal to cosine over sine x, and this sine x times cosine x, we can just put it over 1 just to understand that when we are simplifying, that these two can be seen as fractions, and it's still over cosine squared x. So in order to simplify this, what we do is first we have to get this. When we're subtracting, we have to get into the common denominators. We have sine x, we multiply by sine x. We also multiply by sine x here, so we have sine x squared because there's already a sine x. So we have cosine x minus this multiplied by sine squared, so sine squared x times cosine x all over sine x, and the denominator is same, cosine squared x. Next we have what we do. We can see that there's cosine here, So we can factor that out actually. So we get cosine x parentheses 1 minus sine squared x, and this we just factor it out, the cosine. And it's still over sine x, and then there it's also divided by cosine squared x. So from here to here, what we do is we multiply by sine x on this both numerator and denominator. We multiply by sine x. So this sine x deletes, and then we just multiply sine x here. So this is what we have: cosine x parentheses y minus sine squared x over sine x times cosine squared x. And then what we do is that because there's a cosine x here and cosine squared x here, one of them would cancel out, so this would be gone, and then this cosine squared, because there's two, this would be minus 1, so we would just have cosine x here. So that's why there's 1 minus sine squared x over sine x times cosine x. So we know that 1 minus sine squared x is the same as cosine squared x. That's one of our identities, so we have to know that. So we have cosine squared x over sine x times cosine x. Again, we would be able to cancel out one of the cosines in here, so we had this would cancel out, and we would be left with one cosine. So we had cosine x over sine x, and this is one of our identities, so we know that this could be answered, but also we know that this simplifies into cotangent x. Cosine over sine is cotangent. Okay, so another way we could do this is that we know that cotangent x is equal to the reciprocal of 1 over tan x. So we write that here, and then we also have, we do the same thing we did here, which is sine x times cosine x, but we also put the over 1 just to realize that these are fractions that can be subtracted and simplified, and the denominator stays the same, cosine squared x. Now what we do is that what I did was I multiplied the tan x here. So we multiplied tan x. So we got 1 minus tan x times sine x times cosine x. So this here, and then we multiply the tan x on both sides. And we keep this 1, so 1 minus tan x, like what I said. And then because we multiplied on both sides, we would have the tan x in the denominator as well. So we have tan x times cosine x squared here. So next, what we do is simplify. We know that tan x is equal to sine over cosine. So we do 1 minus sine over cosine, and we keep the same. We have minus sine x times cosine x. And again, we can also convert this tan into sine over cosine, and we keep this denominator the same, the cosine squared x part. So now what we can do is that we can simplify. We have, because it's sine, because there's a cosine here, we know that this would like go away, and this would be reduced to only cosine x. So that's why the denominator is sine x times cosine x. And then this numerator we would simplify into this cosine x would also be canceled out, and this would be a multiplication sign. Actually, I don't know why I put the subtraction. So we have 1 minus, what we have left is 1 minus sine x times sine x. So this equals to sine x squared. So this is our numerator and denominator. We have 1 minus sine squared x over sine x times cosine x. So next we know that because it's 1 minus sine squared x, this is equal to cosine squared x. This is one of our identities, so we need to know that as well. So we have cosine squared x, and we over sine x times cosine x. And so again, we can simplify the numerator and denominator, because this cosine would be gone, and this would be reduced to 1 cosine x. or the power of 1, so we have left cosine over sine, and this is equal to cotangent x, which is the same. So we know that with both ways we got this answer cotangent x. So explain your strategy and why you chose them. So strategy was basically for the first one, strategy was to convert the cotangent to cosine over sine, and then from there we just simplify. We subtract this, we put a common denominator, we factor out cosine. Then what we did is multiply sine x with the numerator and denominator to cancel this out. We have sine x over cosine squared x, the denominator, because cosine x, cosine squared x, we can simplify. We get this. From here to here, what we do is that 1 minus sine squared x is cosine squared x. And we can also simplify the cosine. Here we have and then we get cosine over sine, which is equal to cotangent. Here what I did was I chose this because we know that cotangent is reciprocal, so we can just put 1 over tan. Again, make that the denominator. We can multiply both sides by tan so that there's no more a denominator and the numerator. And so we have is 1 minus tan x times sine x minus cosine x over tan x times cosine x squared. And then tan equals sine over cosine. We multiply, we cancel this out, we might multiply this together. We got 1 minus sine squared x over sine times cosine. And then we can simplify this and this. We get this, and then we can also simplify the cosine. We get this, and we know that cosine over sine is cotangent. And yeah, that's why I chose those strategies.